The first night Jason brought it up, I knew it was a disaster waiting to happen. He had that cocky grin on his face, the kind that meant trouble. "It's gonna be epic, man. We'll be legends by morning." He had no fear, none at all. But me? My gut twisted. I could hear my dad's voice in my head. Walk into a situation with your guard down, and you're already begging for trouble. We'd all been tight since middle school, Jason, Nick, Eric, and me. We weren't the brightest, but we knew how to stay out of trouble by flying under the radar. Jason, though, he lived for pranks. The bigger, the better. And this time he had the wild idea of staging a fake home invasion on Halloween night at old Mr. Hargrove's house, the guy down the street who never said much to anyone. He seemed like an easy target. It sounded insane. I wanted to back out. But Jason had a way of spinning things. By the time he was done, it didn't sound so bad. "We'll freak him out, get some laughs, and by tomorrow, we'll be the talk of the school. Peer pressure? It's a hell of a thing." Still, something felt wrong, but we did it anyway. Ski masks, black hoodies, and cheap plastic knives. Eric waved his knife around like a psycho from a slasher movie, and we all laughed. Looking back, that was the first red flag, how casual we were about it. I should have known better. We got to Hargrove's place just after 10. The streets were dead quiet, not a trick-or-treater in sight. Jason nudged the door with his shoulder, and it creaked open. The damn thing wasn't even locked. We should have turned back right then. But no, Jason thought it was a sign. "See? Told you this would be easy." Inside, the house felt off, too still. The air was stale, like no one had been there for days. We tiptoed in, giggling like idiots, flipping over a few cushions, knocking over a lamp. We were making a scene, just like Jason wanted. I was about to call it when I saw Hargrove. He was standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at us, pale as a ghost. For a split second, I thought he recognized us, but then his eyes changed. They darkened, and the temperature in the room dropped, like someone opened a window in the dead of winter. That's when it all went wrong. The gunshot echoed through the house, louder than I'd ever heard. 1 second, Jason was standing there with that stupid grin. The next, he was on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. His body went limp, like a puppet with its strings cut. Everything stopped. Nick screamed, Eric bolted, and I just stood there, frozen. Hargrove stood at the top of the stairs, the gun still raised, his hand trembling. His lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. It didn't matter. Jason was gone. Nick grabbed me by the arm, shaking me back to reality. "We have to go." His voice cracked. I couldn't move. Not until he pulled me toward the door and my legs finally worked. We ran, left Jason there, bleeding on the cold floor. We scattered into the night like cowards. By the time I got home, I couldn't breathe. I tried to tell myself it wasn't our fault. Hargrove had pulled the trigger, but deep down, I knew better. We had broken in. We had started this. The days that followed were hell. Jason's funeral was a blur, the whispers at school even worse. Everyone had theories, but none of them came close to the truth. We didn't tell anyone what really happened. Not Jason's parents. Not the cops. It was ruled an accident. Self-defense, they said. And we let them believe it. But none of us could shake the guilt. A month later, Eric called me in the middle of the night, his voice shaking. "I think someone's watching me," he whispered. I told him he was being paranoid, that the guilt was messing with his head. But then I started seeing things too. Shadows outside my window, figures lurking in the corner of my eye. Every time I looked, they were gone. But I knew. I wasn't imagining it. Halloween came around again, and the nightmares hadn't stopped. I refused to leave my room that night, curled up in bed, curtains drawn, trying to convince myself it was over. But just after midnight, my phone buzzed. A text from Jason. "It's your turn." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I wanted to believe it was Nick or Eric messing with me, but my gut told me otherwise. Then another text came through. A photo of my house, my bedroom window. Someone was outside, watching me. I bolted out of bed, ripped open the curtains, but there was nothing. No one on the street, just the wind and the eerie quiet of the night. But I could feel it. Jason was gone, but something was out there. And it wasn't going to stop until we paid for what we did. The next morning, Nick called, frantic. Someone had broken into his garage. They hadn't taken anything, but there was a message spray-painted on the wall. "You can't hide." Eric had a similar story. His car had been keyed, his house vandalized, a shadowy figure spotted in his yard. We were being hunted, but by what? Jason was dead. We had seen it. We decided to meet at Nick's basement. It was the safest place we could think of. We huddled together, whispering, trying to make sense of it all. Eric wanted to go to the cops, but Nick shot that down. What are we going to say? That a ghost is after us? Then we heard it. Footsteps above us. Slow, deliberate. We all froze. Nick grabbed a baseball bat, motioning for us to stay quiet. We crept up the stairs, our hearts pounding. The footsteps moved through the kitchen, towards the living room. Nick held up his hand, and we stopped. He took a deep breath, then charged into the living room, bat raised. The room was empty. The front door was wide open, the cold night air blowing in. A single piece of paper lay on the floor, just inside the door. I picked it up, my hands shaking. That night, I stayed at Nick's place. None of us slept. We kept the lights on, every little noise making us jump. The house creaked. The wind howled. It all felt like a threat. Around 3 a.m., the power went out, plunging us into darkness. And then I heard it, Jason's voice. "You thought it was over?" My blood ran cold. The voice echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls. Nick swung the bat at the darkness, hitting nothing. Eric started panicking, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Then the door slammed open, and in the moonlight, I saw a figure. Tall, shadowy, wearing a mask. But it wasn't Jason. It was Mr. Hargrove. He stepped forward, gun in hand, his eyes wide and crazed. "You think you can escape this?" he whispered. "You're mine now." And that's when I realized it wasn't Jason haunting us. It was Hargrove. He'd snapped that night, but he wasn't done. He wasn't letting us go. We weren't the pranksters. We were the punchline. Story 2. It started with the dumbest idea ever. My brother Kyle, always trying to outdo everyone with his cheap stunts, set up a zombie in our front yard. Halloween was his time to shine. He loved scaring the hell out of the neighborhood kids. He got this old, torn-up zombie mask, smeared himself with fake blood, and hid behind a tree. Dumb jocks like Kyle lived for these moments. He loved the attention. I should have stopped him, but I was too busy thinking about how I'd tell him his pranks were getting old. Anyway, Halloween night came and kids showed up in packs. Parents stayed in their cars, rolling through slowly like vultures. The neighborhood, our little piece of cheap suburbia, was alive with shouts and laughter. It was one of those nights where you could almost forget how run down everything felt. Almost. Kyle jumped out from behind the tree, moaning like some idiot, staggering toward a group of kids. The parents didn't even blink. They knew Kyle. But one car? One car wasn't paying attention. A guy in a beat-up sedan, probably distracted, probably texting. He swerved when he saw Kyle, panicked. Tires screeched, and before anyone could react, the car hit this guy, just a bystander walking his dog, launching him into the air like a rag doll. I didn't know him, never seen his face before, but he looked familiar, like he belonged to this place. It's always the quiet ones you don't notice until it's too late. Kyle froze. The kids screamed, running, but Kyle just stood there like a statue. The man was lying there, his body twisted in ways that didn't look human anymore. His dog barking, pulling on the leash, as if trying to wake him up. No one moved. The whole street, silent. We didn't call the cops right away. Kyle couldn't stop shaking. "It wasn't my fault," he kept saying. Like that mattered. Next day, the cops were everywhere. They knocked on doors, but nobody had seen anything, or at least nobody said they did. We stayed quiet. Kyle stopped going outside, not even to prank kids anymore. He thought we'd get away with it. Just one accident, a freak thing, but it didn't end there. The guy's name was Patrick. Lived alone, no family, some weird loner type. They buried him quick, no fuss. People moved on like they always do. That's when things started getting weird. A week later, we heard noises outside at night. Not regular noises, shuffling sounds, like someone dragging their feet. Kyle swore he saw shadows moving in the yard. I didn't believe him at first. I figured he was losing it, but then I started hearing things too. It wasn't the zombie prank coming back to haunt us. It was real. Patrick wasn't dead, or at least not all the way dead. He'd show up outside our window, just standing there, his eyes locked on us, even though they'd buried him 6 feet under. Every night he'd get closer. Kyle tried to leave town. Dumb jock move, thinking he could run from it. I watched from the window as he packed his car, shaking, muttering something about not being able to take it anymore. But before he could drive off, he stopped. Just froze in place. Then he started walking, like he wasn't in control anymore. He walked straight back to the spot where Patrick died and just stood there. Didn't move, didn't talk, just stared into space. That's when I realized it wasn't Patrick haunting us. It was guilt. The guilt of thinking you could play with people's lives and walk away untouched. I thought I was smarter, better than Kyle. But it's been weeks now, and I can't sleep. Every night I hear footsteps, getting closer. Maybe it's Patrick. Maybe it's not. But either way, I'm next. Story 3. It follows a group of college friends who thought it would be hilarious to prank their friend, a convenience store clerk, by pretending to rob the store with fake guns. They planned everything meticulously. The masks, the timing, and the dramatic entrance, assuming their friend would recognize them instantly and laugh it off. But what they didn't account for was the natural instinct of self-preservation in a scenario that feels terrifyingly real. On the fateful night, the friends burst into the small convenience store, their laughter muffled behind plastic masks, their fake guns brandished as they shouted half-rehearsed demands. The young clerk, their friend, had no clue who these masked intruders were. He had worked late shifts before, had dealt with strange customers, and had felt uneasy at times. But nothing compared to the shock and fear he felt at that moment. The heart-pounding terror took over, and time seemed to slow down as adrenaline flooded his veins. His mind flashed through the possibilities. He might be robbed, harmed, or worse. All those safety drills he'd been trained for blurred into one singular thought: survival. With shaky hands, he reached under the counter for the small handgun the store kept for emergencies, his heart pounding harder with each second that passed. The students, oblivious to the danger they were putting themselves in, continued their act, unaware that their friend's fear had escalated into something deadly. They didn't notice his trembling fingers wrap around the trigger, nor did they see the tears forming in his eyes as he tried to comprehend the situation, unraveling before him. All he saw were two strangers threatening his life, and in the rush of emotions, he acted. A deafening gunshot echoed through the store, followed by stunned silence. One of the masked friends fell to the floor, the laughter dying on his lips, replaced by a pained gasp. The other dropped his fake gun, backing away, his hands raised as the reality of what they had done sank in. The clerk, realizing it was his friends, collapsed in shock, the gun slipping from his grasp as tears streamed down his face. The prank, intended to be a moment of laughter and shock, had turned into a nightmare. The remaining friend screamed for help, dialing 911 with trembling hands as the clerk sat numb on the cold floor beside the one he'd just shot. The store, once filled with planned mischief, was now a scene of grief and disbelief, a cruel reminder of how quickly things could go wrong when fear and reality collide. In the aftermath, the authorities arrived, and the surviving friends were questioned. It was clear that none of them had ever intended for anything like this to happen. The prank had been a tragic miscalculation, a misunderstanding of the depths of human fear. The clerk was left devastated, haunted by the weight of his actions. He had only wanted to protect himself, but in doing so, he had taken the life of a friend. The story spread quickly, with many debating the morality of what had transpired. Was the clerk at fault for reacting in fear? Were the students to blame for their poor judgment? Opinions clashed, but one thing was certain: a life had been lost, and no amount of discussion could change that. It served as a grim lesson on the consequences of actions, the fragility of trust, and the dangers of assuming that everyone else will perceive a situation the same way you do. The prank, intended to create a laugh, instead created a scar, one that would stay with the survivors for the rest of their lives.